So hello everyone, thank you for joining us online or in person. The Zionist and post-Zionist visions today on the 30th of May, 2 o'clock in Lecture to be at a new campus online by Zoom. So this event unites both of our Parks Visiting Fellows for 2022. We'll be in conversation with each other and our audience on shared topics. We're excited to hear from both of our fellows and a dialogue that's clearly possible from two experts working on topics with many themes of mutual interest. Perhaps particularly of interest, the implications for the transmission of ideas and how these complex processes can impinge upon the creation of identities in numerous ways, not least in terms of Jewish and Palestinian identities. So I'm going to start by saying a little bit about our visiting fellow, Arie Dubnov, an associate professor of history and a Max Ticton chair of Israel Studies at George Washington University. He's the author of the intellectual biography Cy Berlin, The Journey of the Jewish Liberal, and the editor of two collections, Zionism, A View from the Outside, and Partitions, A Transnational History of 20th Century Territorial Separatism. So he's speaking today on the following topic: between Metropole and Colony, Leon Roth, the early years of the Hebrew University and circulation of knowledge between Britain and Mandatory Palestine. And I will say a little bit about Arie's essay. I won't read out the entire blurb, but I'll give you kind of a snippet. This lecture is going to examine how during the mandatory period, the Anglo-Jewish Zionist philosopher Leon Roth developed a unique cultural Zionist vision of Jerusalem and its new university, compatible with British imperial theories, including a vision of Jerusalem as sitting at the centre of a global Hebraic spiritual community, commonwealth even, and indeed the influence of this individual on people including John Locke, J.S. Mill, Bertrand Russell, and his speeches and essays provide evidence for his attempt to inject British liberal ideas into Zionist discourse. The reconstruction of Roth's scholarly itinerary and personal story offers a unique window into a broad story of the dynamics of intra and trans-imperial transmission of ideas. And I could also say a little bit about our second fellow as well, who's just joined us very recently from Sydney, Dr. Isabel Hesser, senior lecturer in the English department at the University of Sydney. Her research is situated at the intersection of post-colonial Jewish and Middle Eastern studies, the author of The Politics of Jewishness and the editor of Literary Representations to the Palestinian Conflict after the Second Intifada, and she's currently completing her second monograph, which examines the representation, I should say, of Israel and Palestine in contemporary British and German culture. And her paper today is called Counterfactual: Israel's Zionism and Nation Building in Contemporary Jewish Writing, a paper considering works by Jewish writers who imagined what would have happened if the Jewish state had not been established in Palestine, but in a different geographical location. It speaks of transformative desire that motivated Zionism as a national movement at the end of the 19th and start of the 20th century, and it explores a series of novels looking at specific crises and uncertainty, thinking about Jewish identity in the contemporary period, exploring an alternate history of Jewish identity that's going into the 21st century. So it's got, strong contemporary relevance as well as a really kind of interesting historical and historiographical base. So at this point, maybe I'll pass over to the first visiting fellow, Arie Dubnov, who very happy to say is joining us. And he will be giving his paper, and we can follow this maybe with Isabel Hesser, and later on we can have a question and answer session.
Okay. Thank you so much. So I'll move over here, and I'll be sharing my screen. Everyone can hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So first and foremost, thank you so much for not only this very lovely introduction, but really, George and Claire, thank you for hosting me here at Southampton for the past month. It flew very quickly, and it was really a delightful experience. And it's a delightful experience no matter what, because always in our line of business, we're sucked into teaching and service, and rarely do we have the time to just sit down and do our work and reflection and research. But even more so after a long pandemic, to travel and to really use the wonderful archives here today. So once the presentation will be, the PowerPoint presentation.
I don't know why I can't do it.
I'll just share, we'll share in a second the PowerPoint. Oh, okay.
Can you see it?
Yeah. And then let's turn just full screen. Wonderful. I mean, as you can see, I prepared a PowerPoint that would speak to the present moment in British history with a lot of Union Jacks in it. But the topic of my very brief talk today is as you can see from this very long and convoluted title, I'm trying to, in my research, to do several things. My background training-wise is intellectual history, so I'm interested in political ideas and the way they are transmitted over time and space. And for years now, I've been trying to think about connections between Jewish thinkers and the British Empire. And as you can understand from the story of pre-independence Palestine, pre-1948 Palestine, that's of course an immediate meeting point. And I think that this is part of a larger question that has to do with opening questions about the relationship between empire and nation state. And here I'll try to do with my Israeli chutzpah, as we call it, a bold intervention and even question Doyens and the big figures in the field, that we tend to read 20th century history as almost a zero-sum game between empire and nationalism. And a very convenient way in which, when I was a student, it was very dominant, a very convenient way in which we even periodicize and we distinguish between the 19th century and the 20th century, the long 19th century and the short 20th century, is between what Eric Hobsbawm famously called the age of empire, and from there, a very quick transition to the age of extremes. And this is a very clear transition. And in one of the assumptions, and of course I'm using Eric Hobsbawm just as an example, one of the underlying assumptions is that there's a very clear cut, and World War I is of course this definitive cutting point in which multinational empires disappear. The Habsburg Empire disappears, the Ottoman Empire collapses, and so on, and the Russian Empire, of course. And we've entered the age of extreme nationalism and pathological nationalism, that and so on. Of course, there's a much merit to this narrative, but it misses, if you'd like, the story of course, the two empires that did survive World War I, the British and the French, and of course, the very specific contours and a very complicated landscape of interwar period. And this is also part of the narrative that is being challenged in the literature in recent years. So I made an alluded in my introduction and the blurb to this talk to the famous book and a programmatic essay by Frederick Cooper and Laura Stoller that started challenging the zero-sum game assumptions that nation building and empire building are two contradictory efforts. And they were very, not alone, but they were very instrumental in vocalizing the idea that nation building and empire building were mutually constitutive projects. And when we think about even post-colonial states that emerged from the debris of empires later on in processes of decolonization, we can see elements and dimensions and even ideas about imaginary and physical space of inclusion. How do you think about citizenship? How do you think about sovereignty, participation, and so on, that were developed during the colonial period, but then transmitted themselves in a very odd way to the post-colonial era. And in a way, Jewish studies today began undergoing that imperial turn. And I used in the slide alluding to one of the most significant books that made a bold intervention in the field, Colonialism and the Jews, that was edited by Ethan Katz and Lisa Leff and Maud Mandel. They're not alone, but that was one of the books that kind of called upon us as Jewish historians to take empire and colonialism seriously. But funny and weird as it may sound, especially in the context we are having of our conversation here, the British Empire is still pretty much left out of those conversations, which is quite odd. So my talk today, in a way, is not an attempt to unpack the entire question of how Jewish studies need to take the colonial turn, but I will take the story of one single philosopher and thinker, individual, Leon Roth, as a window opener, to highlight some of those tensions and dimensions and so on. So who was Leon Roth, or as he signed his writings in Hebrew, Hayim Yehuda Roth? Leon Roth was an Anglo-Jew, a British Jew, born in 1896, trained as a philosopher at Oxford, and later on held a very short time temporary position at Manchester University, where he studied with Samuel Alexander, and soon thereafter moved to Palestine to take a very distinguished position at the newly established Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And he was appointed the inaugural Achad Ha'am Chair of Philosophy at the Hebrew University, someone that almost with his bare hands, with very few collaborators, established philosophy as a field of academic studies in the Hebrew University, and if you'd like, in Israel at the same time. Later on, he was joined by Shmuel Hugo Bergman and other German-speaking Jews, but his impact was enormous. And he even rose later on to the top and became the rector of the Hebrew University, and really very much shaped the way in which the university in its early years worked and established. And if his name might be familiar to some of you, Leon Roth is actually the older brother of Cecil Roth, or Bezalel Roth in his Hebrew Jewish name, who was arguably the most dominant, the most prolific Anglo-Jewish historian of his age. But Cecil Roth stayed in Britain. He had a position at Oxford, but of course the two brothers were in touch and corresponded. And one of the nice things I benefited tremendously from staying here at Southampton was the fact that Cecil Roth's papers are housed here, so I could understand a few of the dynamics from here. And even if you'll go to Jerusalem, there's to this day a small square that is called the Roth Brothers Square, despite the fact one lived in Palestine, the other never lived. So you can see here like a very cerebral and a very impressive family of scholars. One historian who was kind of the first in line of his generation. The second is a philosopher, and there's a clear connection between them all the time, and so on and so forth. So it's not only the similarity in their hairstyle and fondness of the same rounded glasses that brings them together. And part of my argument is that for both of them, there was no contradiction whatsoever between their commitment to Jewish nationalism, namely Zionism, and their patriotism and commitment to the British Empire. And they're two very good examples of seeing these two projects going hand in hand. So I've mentioned the fact that Leon Roth moved to Palestine relatively early on in his career. Just a quick contextual remarks. The idea for a Hebrew university trickles and circulates long before the British occupied Palestine in World War I, but the first moves towards building a real university can be found immediately after the war. In July 1918, the cornerstone ceremony at Mount Scopus, and a few years later, in April 1925, the university is officially opened and established. It's a power display, if you'd like, for the British Empire. It's not a coincidence that Lord Balfour himself is coming to give the opening speech. If you go, the Hebrew University is my alma mater, so on the way to my classes, to the lecture hall, you could still see this wonderful portrait of the opening ceremony with Lord Balfour giving his speech. Roth, by the way, was present at that celebration, still representing Manchester University, but very soon thereafter was invited to become the inaugural chair of and to found the philosophy department. And part of what Roth does, which has a long-lasting impact on Israeli intellectual life, is that he inaugurates the translation of masterpiece, kind of a canonical text in philosophy into Hebrew. So part of what you have here is kind of a pioneering effort of deciding what are the great texts that should be translated into Hebrew. Some of them are translated by himself, especially he's especially fond of both Plato, but he's also a great expert on Descartes and as a big admirer of Spinoza. But later on, he is kind of the crown figure that solicits other translators to translate these booklets. Just to clarify, when I was an undergraduate student at the Hebrew University, we would still be using these small booklets that originated in his project. And it's ongoing, and it's something that I won't be able to go into discussion here to see what are the texts that he chose that would be included in it. I've mentioned Bertrand Russell and John Stuart Mill, because part of what he's doing here is both kind of bringing European philosophy at its best to the new students at the Hebrew University, but also he's introducing what he considers to be liberal ideas. So he's importing ideas, if you'd like, in this very concrete way, but he's also importing other ideas. And here he's importing what I would call, this is part of a larger move I'm trying to do in my next book, is part and parcel of a greater group of thinkers that are liberal imperialists of a new kind. And what do I mean by liberal imperialists? And why do you see the portrait of this gentleman, Sir Alfred Zimmern, on the screen? Towards at the early years of the 20th century, even before World War I, you could see a serious thought that is given, especially among classicists at Oxford, the people that were Roth's mentors, to how to conceive of the British Empire in a new way. And this is part of a bigger argument that when we're thinking about empire, we tend to think about it as a frozen structure, while in fact, the thinkers, at least the political thinkers, saw the empire as entering a new stage, as constantly evolving. And Sir Alfred Zimmern was one of the key figures to start arguing that we are about to enter a new age in imperial development. He coined the term the Third Empire, in which the empire, the British Empire, would look much more similar to the Greek Athenian League. What do we mean by that? Discard older models about the Roman Empire. Roman Empire was exactly what everyone wanted to avoid. Roman Empire was overstretched, was centralized, it collapsed, especially after Gibbon. No one wants to continue comparing the British Empire to Rome. And the model is just like the multiple city-states that govern themselves in everyday life. That's okay for me.
It's okay.
So that the British Empire should evolve into this kind of a network or a commonwealth of multiple city-states. And this is not something that I've discovered. This is well established in the literature. It's not a coincidence that Zimmern starts his career as a classicist studying Athens, and his textbook on the Greek Commonwealth is of immense importance. It really shapes the way in which a generation of thinkers are thinking about the empire. By the way, Arnold J. Toynbee was a close student of his and so on. And the term British Commonwealth of Nations comes from that book. So first it was imagining the Greek model, and also the fact that it's also kind of a Navy-based. How on earth is that connected to Zionism? So first and foremost, Zionists were acutely aware of that type of discourse, and they were familiar with Zimmern and his ideas and the circle. But also it was reciprocal, because in the 1920s, something else happens. The British Zionists start translating into English, Ahad Am. Again, opening brackets. Ahad Ha'am, one of the most significant thinkers and intellectuals of the Zionist movement, and what we tend to call the father of cultural Zionists. And he believes that Zionism is not about state making. It's not about creating a political entity. He was kind of the bitter rival of Theodor Herzl. He was seeing Zionism as a renaissance, a cultural renaissance, as a way of invigorating new modern Jewish thought. And Ahad Ha'am is still alive during the 20s. He dies in the late 20s. And British Zionists such as Leon Simon, who you can see here, who translates Ahad Ha'am into English, are big admirers of Ahad Ha'am, and of course Leon Roth. And why do I think that this is a crucial element? Because the Ahad Ha'amian version of Zionism was the way for them to make Zionism completely compatible with the British Empire. For them, the crowning achievement of the Ahad Ha'amian Zionist project is to create a new center of learning, namely the Hebrew University. This was exactly kind of the idea of Mitzion Tetzetov, from Zion, Torah, or new learning will spread towards four corners of the globe. And this doesn't put them in any contradiction with their commitment to empire. In the way the British Empire would be the platform through which these ideas would disseminate. And for surprising as it may sound to you, though Alfred Zimmern is not a Jew, though he has some Jewish background, he himself was a devout Christian, he also discovers Ahad Ha'am. And he reads Ahad Ha'am, and in the later editions of that same important textbook I've mentioned on the British Commonwealth, he starts comparing Ahad Ha'am with Herodotus and kind of starts saying, yes, the ideas I found in the Zionism of Ahad Ha'am is exactly goes hand in hand with my vision of this Commonwealth, and so on and so forth. So you have like a perfect dialogue. So it's even not a one-sided dialogue. It's not only the Zionists are looking up at the British imperial thinkers and saying, yes, we need to shape our ideas vis-a-vis them. It's even in the case of Zimmern, they are, thanks to these translations, acutely aware of what the Zionists are saying and are saying, yes, these projects are compatible, they work hand in hand. And hence, when Leon Roth becomes Ahad Ha'am chair of philosophy, part of what he does is exactly to make these connections more concrete. As the chair, as someone that has the main chair of Ahad Ha'am, he would give these annual lectures in which he interprets Ahad Ha'am. So anyone who studies Ahad Ha'am to this day needs to read a lot of Leon Roth, because he was, a key interpreter that presents Ahad Ha'am as a great philosopher, and he will give these annual lectures. But you will see how his reading of Ahad Ha'am is really done in the light of that kind of a liberal imperial model. And just to clarify, he's not an outlier or completely divorced from his context. Even key Zionists, as you can see in this photo, Hayim Yehuda, the famous Zionist leader that was assassinated in the 1930s, in the late 1920s and 30s, understands the British are here to stay, we need to understand the empire. He translates into Hebrew Basil Williams' very famous book about the British Empire, which was also a textbook. And in his later writings, even his unfinished symphony that he never finished, that really imagined Palestine as part of this British, of that British Empire. Later Zionist readings were very busy cleaning all these messages from Arlozorov to present Arlozorov and the Zionists as always striving towards a nation state, divorced and sovereign and divorced from the empire. And another, I have numerous other anecdotal examples of this case. Shmuel Osishkin, the son of the famous Osishkin, who was a key Zionist leader, is writing chapters in the English constitutional law in Hebrew. The introduction is also coming from a very distinguished British Jew, Norman Bentwich, who was the advisor for the mandatory government on legal matters. So part of the idea that they're writing and reading English constitutional law is under the assumption that the empire is here, and we need to find our way to think about our national project under the auspices of empire. And of course, this is not an abstract question. In 1927, Lord Josiah Wedgwood comes up with a bold idea that never materializes, but really opens up the imagination for so many people that is saying, yes, Palestine will follow the path of Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the other dominions, and will become the seventh dominion to join the British Commonwealth of Nations. So imagine the Israeli flag with a small Union Jack at the corner, just like the Australian and New Zealand flag. And this is a conversation. And the idea of turning Palestine into a dominion would continue circulating and surfacing time and again until the very last moment. Even in November 1947, in debates about the partition plan in the UN, some Zionists were still saying, no, the idea is to become a state that is under the British Commonwealth of Nations. So, of course, he's joining a big group. But throughout the late 30s and especially in the 40s and during World War II, Leon Roth, as a philosopher teaching at Hebrew University, will start seeing pushback. And sometimes the pushback would come from the students themselves that were not so keen and were not those such big Anglophiles and started becoming attracted to anti-colonial ideals and so on and so forth. So Roth of the 1940s is a fascinating figure that is actually busy telling his students in Hebrew about how wonderful the Britain is. And he's sponsoring lectures in Jerusalem about the British. It really sounds almost like a cliche type of Anglophile kind of a series of lectures about the British character and how the British are fair sports and about parliamentarism and about constitution. And I know that you're all frustrated about British rule, but at the end of the day, they're the good guys and so on. And this 7 chapters in English, in England and English democracy is only one example of numerous writings they will produce during the 40s on that subject. But in the 1948 war, he is very close to a nervous breakdown. So the entire project is collapsing in front of his eyes. And this is a very interesting move in which develops from which later Roth intellectually develops, because during the war he will see new levels of violence and will become a very vocal intellectual, starting to criticize hideous war crimes that are committed during the war. So, for instance, the most infamous war crime the Israelis committed during the 1948 war, the massacre of Deir Yassin. Leon Roth will join his colleagues at the Hebrew University, Martin Bubel and others, and they will write a famous letter to Ben Gurion asking that, unlike other Palestinian villages that were depopulated and then became automatically places where Israel would settle Jewish refugees and newcomers, they asked that Deir Yassin would not be populated with newcomers, and to this day, Deir Yassin was not populated. It turned into a medical facility, a horrific metaphor. It's a psychiatric hospital to this day. So he's involved in this. But even in the early 1950s, Israel will start using retaliation kind of techniques against Fedayeen, against Palestinians that were infiltrating back into Israel. That was even before it was an official policy. And in what can be considered, if you'd like, the first time, if I am a historian of Israel and I'm doing intellectual history and I'm asking myself, where do I find for the first time a document, I can call it like the first time that you have an Israeli intellectual speaking truth to power? Not before 1948, but officially after Israel is independent. Perhaps the letter that Leon Roth writes again with Norman Bentwich and Senator and others after an incident called Sharafat incident is that example. And he starts using a new language. Of course, it is rooted in his earlier readings of Chadam, in which he's talking about Jewish morals and Jewish values that are being that are not being taken into consideration when the IDF is using such methods and so on. And he becomes bitter, and he becomes very start voicing his bitterness about the Zionist project, starts creating bad PR for the university, going on lectures tours in outside Israel, and voices opinions. And then in the early 1950s, he surprises everyone, resigns and leaves Israel and returns, desperate and disappointed, back home to England. And in his last years, he will write essays and articles that these are the types of essays that the Anglo-Jews that I had the chance to chat about my project with are more familiar with. So the Israelis are familiar with the early Roth, that was a chair of philosophy at the Hebrew University, and they're not really interested in Roth after he left Palestine. And in Britain, it's the other way around. He's more familiar through projects like these, writing about Judaism and about Jewish philosophy and Jewish thought. And interestingly, and again, this is my opportunity to thank the Parks Institute for hosting me. Thanks to my work in the archives here, I was able to understand that the background to one of his most important books after the war, Jewish Thought as a Factor in Civilization, it was actually commissioned by UNESCO. And thanks to my work in the archives here, I realized that the person that commissioned and pulled him in, and that to write it for UNESCO is Alan Steinberg, whose papers are also held here, who was from the British delegation to the World's Jewish Congress, and the contact person with UNESCO, the newly established UNESCO. And it's part of a bigger question I would not be able to open here about how in the post-war and post-Holocaust context, suddenly texts like these are produced for UNESCO as part of a series that is there to combat racism. So they bring, a bit like in the joke, a Qadi and a priest and a rabbi enter into a bar. UNESCO is commissioning one expert on Hinduism, and one expert in Buddhism, and one expert in Judaism, and so on and so forth. And Roth is the person to represent Judaism in that context, which is very different. And this is where I'll end. I won't mention that his brother, simply to the time of him. So Roth, in a way, leaves us with a very kind of ambivalent legacy, bequeaths us with a very indirect legacy. On the one hand, he became this kind of vocal, uncompromising intellectual that is fighting against the corrupt use of violence and hideous war crimes that are committed during the 1948 war, and at the same time, he is the British liberal imperial to the back of his bone. And one of the things that I found, and this is always a challenge for a historian, what do you do when you don't have sources? So Roth was prolific, and he wrote all the time, and he left a very rich trail of writings. But on one thing, he almost said nothing. And that was the brutal occupation of Palestine by the British, and in particular, the event you can see in the slide here, the crash of the very violent way in which the British troops crashed the 1936 Arab revolt in Palestine. And the only place where I saw him mentioning anything was actually in a letter to the editor of the London Times, in which he was not only not criticizing excessive use of violence, but actually calling upon the British forces to crush the revolt even more quickly and more brutally, and paraphrasing Hobbes, that hinting that the Palestinian revolts are nasty and British, and that the government therefore needs to make sure that this is also ended and ends up in a short way. So what do we have here? So I think that part of what Leon Roth allows us to see is something that should bother us a lot. Because his criticism of the nation status project is there, and it's valid, and it's attractive, and it's attracting also contemporary readers of Roth that rediscover him due to the agonizing state of affairs in Israel-Palestine today. But there is a blind spot is built into Roth's project, which is the imperial blind spot, in which actually the criticism of the nation state project is actually an apologia for empire from day one, and it's predicated on imperial elements. This is the only case I know of, but I'll be happy to stand corrected, that someone who spent his entire academic career, again, apart from a short stint of 2 or 3 years at Manchester and not in a permanent position, Roth never taught at a British university. But once he's coming back to Britain, he's appointed a fellow of the British Academy. I still need to find a way to get into their archives and to see how come you can take someone who never spent his career in Britain and give him this very distinguished honor. And as you know, when British fellows of the Academy pass away, there's this honorable long obituary that is published by the Academy. So you definitely have it in the case of Roth, and no one even mentions the fact that actually his career is outside Britain. So it also tells you something about that. And when he's leaving his position in Jerusalem, he leaves a card to his former colleagues in which he quotes from the book of Hosea. I'll read it in Hebrew and then I'll translate it into English. Elcha ve'ashuva el ishi harishon ki tov li az me'ata, which is a phrase that reads in King James Bible translation, and I will go and return to my first husband, for then was better with me than now. For him, going to Britain is going back home. And that's not a clear thing. You know, his colleagues, many of whom are German Jews, cannot even imagine, cannot fathom returning to Germany after World War II. For Roth, it's, returning back home is the project. So in a way, we see here a very interesting case in which these two projects are combined. And as I mentioned, the legacy that is left to us is a very ambivalent one. So thank you so much, and sorry for stealing a few more minutes of our time.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. So thanks for that. Thank you very much for that, Arie. That was really fascinating paper, and I'm sure we can follow up some questions later from the audience, online or in person. So we've next got Isabel Hesse speaking on her paper on counterfactual Israel, Zionism and nation building in contemporary Jewish writing.
Is it working?
Yes, PowerPoint looks like it's all working.
Yes. Okay. All right. First of all, thank you to George for the kind introduction and to the Parks Institute for the warm welcome and for hosting me. I'm very excited to be spending the next few weeks here and hopefully to meet lots of you either in person or on Zoom. So thank you everyone as well for joining today. So my paper today is called Counterfactual Israel's Zionism and Nation Building in Contemporary Jewish Writing. And I wanted to start off with, I wanted to start off with a quote by Nava Samuel, one of the writers I'll be talking about today. And she has said that how wonderful it is to play around with history like a deck of cards, placed not necessarily in the right order. Is there a right order? I wonder. Can we fix history and take responsibility of our fate, regardless of where we are? So in my paper today, I want to focus on literature that plays around with the history of Israel by asking, what if a Jewish state had not been established in Palestine, but in a different geopolitical location? Nava Samuel's Israel, published in 2006, Michael Shaven's The Yiddish Policeman's Union, published in 2007, and Lavi Tidar's Unholy Land, published in 2018, interrogate what would have happened if the so-called territorialist who advocated the creation of a Jewish state in any available territory as an immediate solution to Jewish distress, as Adam Roth puts it, had prevailed against the Holy Landers, who were adamant that a Jewish state needed to be established in the biblical land of Israel. Sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. Oops, sorry, this is also the wrong slide. Sorry about that. So today I'm focusing on these three novels that reimagine the history of the establishment of a Jewish state in Israel. And this has been linked to the rise of postmodernism, and specifically I'll quote here from Gabriel Rosenfeld, the blurring of boundaries between fact and fiction, its privileging of other alternate voices, and its playful, ironic reconfiguring of established historical verities. So by including indigenous characters, the Native Americans in Nava Samel's book, the Tlingit in Michael Chabon's novel, and the Nandi in Lavi Tidar's account, and the ways in which indigenous histories are linked to Jewish histories, these works foreground the relationship between others and selves to highlight the impact of settler colonialism on Jewish and Palestinian peoples. Moreover, this inclusion of indigenous characters and histories enables Samel, Chabon, and Tidar to respond to specific crises and uncertainties that Jewish identity is facing in the contemporary period. This is typical of alternative history, as Rosenfeld tells us, because it flourishes in periods of rapid change and uncertainty. On one hand, Jewish identity in the contemporary period is often defined exclusively in relation to the Holocaust in Israel. And on the other hand, and to a certain extent this follows from the previous point, Jewish identity, especially in the 21st century, struggles with being conflated with Israel and its actions, as many critics, such as Judith Butler, have observed. So Samuel, Chabon, and Tidar use alternate histories to reimagine a move away from Zionism and to examine a Jewish identity not exclusively defined by Zionism. This in turn facilitates creating a sense of empathy, or at least sympathy, with Palestinians and Palestinian history, and opens up a space for considering the implications of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians for Jewish and Israeli Jewish identities today. So this is part one, where I talk about Nava Samuel, and this is entitled Not the Only Victims in History, Jewish, Palestinian, and Native American Histories in Israel. So Nava Samuel was an Israeli Jewish author, playwright, and essayist. In her novel Israel, which was published in 2005, but translated in English only in 2016, Samuel revisits the past, the alternate story of the creation of a Jewish homeland in the United States. She was inspired by the history of Mordecai Manuel Noah, who bought Grand Island near the Niagara Falls in upstate New York in 1825, with the purpose of establishing a Jewish state there. Samuel has explained in an interview that she had a specific reason for reconsidering the creation of a Jewish homeland. So she said that I don't want to go back into the past just to recreate the past. What's interesting to me is to recreate the present, not the past. And what really excites me is to speak about the future, but it's wrapped up in the disguise of the past. So as she tells us here, she revisits the past of the creation of a Jewish state in order to consider the implications of the establishment of Israel for Jewish identity, not only in the past, but also projecting these effects into the present and the future. So her novel Israel is divided into three parts, and the second and the third ones are alternate histories, which are the ones that I'll focus on in my paper today. So in the second part of the novel, we have an indigenous character, Little Dove, who tells us the story in the first person. And she lives on Grand Island, so the property or the place that Noah buys in 1825. And Samuel has explained that she has deliberately used this perspective as she wanted her Israeli readers to, and I quote, understand that we were not the only victims in history. In Samuel's novel, Little Dove shows empathy for the suffering of the Jewish people, while anticipating that the Native Americans will undergo a similar fate. And I quote from the novel where Little Dove says, they had a land, so she's talking about the Jewish people, and lost it. And I too am about to lose my homeland and walk the trail of tears. So the use of trail of tears references the forced relocation of Native Americans from their homelands in several US states after the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which was 5 years after Noah bought Grand Island. And Samuel has explicitly linked the use of Little Dove's characters to, and I quote, presenting in her voice an echo of the feelings of injustice done to the Palestinians. So she's establishing clear links between Native American and Palestinian dispossession and displacement. And unsurprisingly, in the novel, indigeneity is also an important perspective for discussing ideas of land and belonging. Little Dove emphasizes that, and I quote, land is not property. It was given to all creatures for custody, exemplifying what is commonly seen as an indigenous perspective on land and ownership. This idea is at odds with Mordecai Manuel Noah's approach as he purchased Grand Island as a future homeland for the Jewish people. And consequently, Little Dove questions his entitlement to the land when she says, this island is my home. For me, it is the whole world. And for the Jewish chief, which is a name for Noah, and she says nothing. So Little Dove's statement could be interpreted as a challenge to the territorialist position that a Jewish homeland can be established anywhere. But her reflections also become a critique of Zionism and the ways in which the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine resulted in the dispossession and displacement of the Palestinian people. While the second part of the novel ends with Noah's death and his plan for establishing a Jewish homeland have failed because no one followed his call to move to Grand Island. In the third part of Israel, which is subtitled An Alternate History and set in 2001, Samuel examines what would have happened if the Jewish people had followed the call and there would have been a Jewish state created as a separate state in the United States. So the reader here witnesses a flourishing Jewish state, as in this version, people did follow Noah's call to come to their newly created homeland, and they had a refuge when the Holocaust happened, and they avoided the fate of many other victims of the Nazis. However, an issue that haunts this section of the novel is the cost at which the Jewish people established their own homeland, reflecting Lildorf's concerns in part 2. One of the questions that Jewish presidential candidate and governor of Israel, so the newly created state, Jewish state, Emmanuel Wernona Noah, gets asked at a press conference is the following. What about the claims of the original Native Americans? They argue that the Jews imposed themselves on Grant Island and seek to prove that the deed of title, even if legal, does not confer a bond between nation and land. The natives demand that the law of return be applied to anyone who has been an islander for generations, and they also want an official apology. So this quote emphasizes that indigenous claims to the land are based on a relationship with the land that the Jewish people cannot profess in this case. And once again, this can be read as a thinly veiled allusion to how Jewish rights to Palestine are seen as overriding Palestinian rights due to the Zionist claim that God had given the land to the Jews. Throughout the novel, Samuel uses indigeneity not only to establish connections between Native American and Jewish histories, but equally between Native American and Palestinian people in order to critically engage with Israel's actions. This twofold approach allows her to create links with the situation in Israel and encourages her readers to examine Jewish history both from the perspective of victimhood and from the perspective of nation building. The resulting shift in modes of thinking about Jewish and Palestinian histories leads to a critical revision of the history of Zionism and the establishment of Israel in 1948, including ideas about victimhood and displacement. This brings me to the second part of my talk, where I'm going to focus on Michael Chabon's novel, and this is entitled Strange Times to be a Jew, Israel and Jewish Diaspora Identity in the Yiddish Policemen's Union. So Jewish American writer Michael Chabon's Yiddish Policemen's Union is set in the early 2000s in Sitka, Alaska, where the Jewish people have been granted sovereignty of Sitka district for a duration of 60 years, after which this territory reverts to the state of Alaska. Chabon's novel is set in the months leading up to the imminent reversion, which draws attention to precarity of not having a homeland, underlined by the repetition of the phrase, strange times to be a Jew. This creates a direct link between the loss of Israel and the loss of sovereignty as part of the reversion, and in many ways it supports Zionism's case for the importance of a Jewish sovereign state, where Jewish people are the majority and govern themselves. However, as Chabon has explained in an interview, in his novel he was interested in imagining, and I quote, what the world would look like without the state of Israel. In the Yiddish Policemen's Union, there is no state of Israel, and the Middle East is depicted as a not very desirable location to create one. And this is, for example, obvious in a description of Jerusalem, where Jerusalem is described as, and I quote, a city of blood and slogans painted on the walls, severed heads on telephone poles. On one hand, the deterioration of Jerusalem and by extension the Holy Land could be attributed to the absence of Jewish people, which aligns with Zionism's depiction of the land as empty. On the other hand, this description, minus the severed heads, could be read as a comment on present-day Israel and the ongoing conflict between Israelis and the Palestinians. This is typical for Chabon's novel, as it often makes statements or describes situations that can at first be read as supporting Zionism, only to then turn into trenchant critiques of Zionism and the necessity for a Jewish state with a Jewish majority. And Chabon himself has also said that, and I quote, I have a very strong feeling of complete ambivalence about a world without Israel. So this is reflected in his own ambivalence towards the state of Israel. But one aspect of creating a Jewish homeland that Chabon is certainly not ambivalent about are the impacts of nation building. In the novel, when the first settlers, the so-called polar bear generation, arrive in the 1940s, they are disappointed to find that the reality does not match the fiction they had created about their new homeland. And I quote from the novel, no rolling prairies dotted with buffalo, no feathered Indians on horseback, only a spine of flooded mountains and 50,000 linguid village dwellers already in possession of the most flat and usable land. So in Chabon's novel, what we see is that instead of reinventing their identity, the first settlers are forced, at least initially, to reproduce their life in the diaspora. And they say the following, there's nowhere to spread out, to grow, to do anything more than crowd together in a teeming style of Vilna or Lodz. So this mirrors the problems of early Zionism, which wanted to create a new national identity that was divorced from the Jewish diaspora experience after the Holocaust as one defined by weakness and passivity. And instead it emphasizes the importance of a new, strong pioneering identity embodied in the idea of the Sabra. The presence of an indigenous population in Chabon's novel challenges Jewish identity in Alaska as it did Zionist identity in Palestine, both ideologically and physically. While the parallels with the history of the Palestinians drawn in Chabon's novel are less obvious, and less explicit critiques of the state of Israel and its treatment of the Palestinians than the ones established by Samuel and Tida, as we'll see in a minute, they are nevertheless hard not to make by Shaban's readers. So in his novel, he explores alternative ways of being Jewish outside of a Jewish homeland with a Jewish majority through his counterfactual history of a Jewish district in Alaska. In spite of often offering ambiguous criticisms of Israel and Zionism and rejecting direct comparisons between the Tlingit and the Palestinians, Shaban certainly questions Zionism and the establishment of Israel and its consequence for Jewish identity, both for the early Zionists and contemporary Jewry inside and outside of Israel. And in the final part of my paper, I wanted to briefly talk about another novel to give you almost a snapshot of 3 different approaches to depicting counterfactual histories of Israel. And this is Lavie Tidar's Unholy Land, where I'm thinking about parallel histories and disputed territories. So Lavie Tidar takes a slightly different approach to Samuel and Shaban. Rather than imagining a Jewish homeland as a state or a district within the United States, he examines what would have happened if a Jewish state had been established in British East Africa between Uganda and Kenya. British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain offered this territory to the World Zionist Congress in 1903. And as Adam Rovner observes, this offer was linked to Britain's colonial mission since, and I quote, "The Jews would be used to populate the empire and render the dark continent a shade lighter, while diverting a Jewish invasion from its own shores." The Zionist movement was divided on the offer, but after a delegation, including a young Russian Jew called Nahum Wilbush, was sent to East Africa to inspect the proposed area for settlement, they found the land populated by dangerous animals and a number of indigenous people who unsurprisingly were not keen to receive a large influx of foreigners. So the offer was declined. But in the introduction to his book Unholy Land, Tidar explains that he was intrigued by this expedition and the consequences of this offer being rejected. And he reflects that, and I quote, "A perhaps apocryphal story tells of an aging Wilbush flying over the territory many years later, ruefully reflecting that the Holocaust might never have happened had the plan gone ahead." So in his novel, Tidar imagines not only a world where a Jewish state is established in British East Africa and where the Holocaust did not happen, but he also imagines other alternative worlds, drawing on the many worlds models. So his novel is quite science fiction-y, so he uses some of the common tropes where you might have parallel worlds, whereas the other novels are a bit closer to a realist approach to depicting the state, a Jewish state in different locations. So in Tidar's novel, the reader is initially immersed in the world where a Jewish homeland was established in British East Africa, since Wilbush came back from his expedition with a positive report. As a result, the Zionist Congress accepted Chamberlain's offer and established a Jewish state called Palestina in East Africa. By choosing to name this land Palestina rather than Israel and removing it from the Middle East, Tidar consciously severs the biblical link between the Jewish nation and its homeland. Palestina has many similarities with contemporary Israel, including a wall that has been built between the Jewish state and what is referred to as the disputed territories, an area that is inhabited by the Nandi. So like Samuel and Shaban, Tidar uses a population indigenous to the region to set up parallels with the experience of the Palestinians. However, it is worth considering why Tidar uses this specific ethnic group, so the Nandi, apart from the fact that they lived in the territory that was promised to the Jews at the turn of the century. So the Nandi lost a lot of their land under British colonial rule, and as Diana Ellis argues, they lost more land than many other Kenyan peoples. Moreover, historically, the Nandi were known for their resistance against Europeans, and until 1906, and I quote Alice here, the military threat of the Nandi rendered European settlement of the Uasin Gishu Plateau insecure. As such, dispossession and resistance are two key aspects of the Nandi people's history, which allow Tidar to make important links with Palestinian history as well. And similar to Samuel and Shaban, Tidar transplants the conflict into a different geopolitical context to encourage his readers, particularly his Israeli Jewish readers, to achieve a critical detachment from this conflict and to rethink their position in relation to what is happening in the Middle East. In the novel, the main character Tirosh reflects that, and I quote, "We construct a world of make-believe in order to consider how our own world is constructed." Tidar's world of make-believe certainly contributes to exposing how our own world is constructed, as the inability of different worlds to remain apart in a novel negates the idea that the history of the Jewish people can be separated from the history of the Palestinian people. Instead, the novel emphasizes that these histories are intertwined and that many of the issues that Jewish identity faces today cannot be divorced from the conflict in Israel-Palestine. So to conclude, in the epigraph to this paper, Nava Samuel asks, can we fix history and take responsibility of our fate? Her novel suggests that you certainly can take responsibility for your fate, but that history cannot be undone, which aligns with Tidar's comment in the afterword to his novel that, and I quote, "There's only one world we live in, as imperfect as it may be, and fantasy provides no escape." However, even if Samuel Chabon and Hida's alternative accounts of the creation of Israel might not be able to fix history, they do enable their audiences to see the conflict in Israel-Palestine and its implications for Israeli Jewish identity and Jewish identity more clearly through the prism of indigenous histories, which allow them to make connections with Jewish and Palestinian histories and their intersections. Thank you.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. Yeah, and yeah, another interesting paper. Arie, would you like to come and sit down? You can take my chair. You're welcome to do so while I pace the room. So yeah, I think that's great. Thank you very much, Isabel. So we've now got a bit of time, I think, for questions. If anyone in the audience has a question they'd like to ask? Yeah.
Can you pass your microphone?
Sure, yeah. Can.
Not too close.
At this close.
Thank you so much, George, for the presentation. So my question simply is, you said that the UK was considering Palestine as a 7th Commonwealth country. So then why did it create Israel? What was the reason for creating just a country, although there was already a nation there, a country there? So why did we have to create another country beside Palestine in that area? Like I still cannot understand why did we need a country only for Jewish people? Like, for example, if you look into all other religions, there is no a country only for Muslims, for Catholics, for Orthodox, for Protestants. So why did we need a country only for Jewish people? This is my question. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Should we maybe take perhaps a couple more questions? I find it quite useful in sharing these kind of events to do the questions in rounds. Yep, I can see Joseph. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Let me. Okay. I'm going to try two questions for Arie. I guess the first question is, to what extent did the connection between British Empire and Mandate Palestine, Israel continue after statehood? I'm thinking of both David Feldman's book on article on Zionism and the Labour Party post-war, and also Stephen Wenderhorst's book about British Jewry and Zionism. And it seems like in the 1950s, at least, that did continue. There was this interest by the Zionist Federation, amongst others, to present continuity with the British Empire. And that's kind of, I wonder how long that continued and how that worked out. And second question to you again is kind of, I guess, the opposite. I feel that in British Jewish and British Zionist context, particularly, there's been a tendency to emphasize the last part of the Mandate period where there was great conflict between the British and the Zionists, and a playing down of that early period of maybe where there's more partnership, as you suggested. And I just wondered, kind of ask you to reflect on why that dynamic has played out. Is it due to a desire to present Zionism as an anti or post-colonial movement rather than a colonial one, or a continuation of colonialism? And then to Isabel, I'm afraid I've only read the Chabon of the three novels. Probably other people are in that category as well. I just wondered if you could say something about the sort of the Yiddish aspect of it. It seemed to me quite significant in his portrayal, sort of quite a romantic portrayal of a Yiddish speaking territory. And it kind of ties into the territorialist projects who were trying to create places like Kimberley, like a Yiddish-speaking territory. And that makes me see his work as kind of quite pro-diasporist, or at least romantic about diasporism. I got the sense of real portrayal of all three, that there was a kind of both romanticism and a critique, and a suggestion that the kind of the problems of Zionism would be inevitable to anywhere with sort of an ethnic state, however well-intentioned, however fortuitous the initial circumstances, you get some of the same problems wherever you try to create just a state for that one particular group.
Thank you very much. Great questions. So I'm just going to hand the mic over to Arie. Okay, so Arie and Isabel can come back to some of the questions. I can see there's another one in the chat, but maybe we'll have the responses first and then go to the online stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Close, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for your questions. So the idea of turning Palestine into seventh dominion was
I need to take, an important caveat. It was an idea that was proposed by Josiah Wedgwood, who was a member of parliament, but was very quickly rejected in the British Parliament. Why it was rejected has to do with the specific setting of what is a mandate. And that really requires us to open up an entire seminar and reread Susan Peterson's book about the League of Nations and how it creates mandates and so on. In order to do it, Britain will have to kind of change the entire, cancel out the mandate in Palestine, which is for them something that is given from an international order and so on. So that's part of the practicalities of why it was rejected on very quickly in the metropole, so to speak. But in the colony, I argue it was the language that so many Jewish nationalists were saying, oh, now we can start imagining a state. Now, I'm always emphasizing to my students, this is a state in a lowercase s. It's not a nation state that is divorced from empire, but an idea of a nation that is contained within the empire. Now, we tend to read history with Israel-Palestine as exceptionalism. And of course, every situation has its own unique contours. But we will see it in a context of transnational history of partition politics. This is the story that is happening. Part of the project that we are seeing in the second half of the mandatory period is the way in which both the British thinkers and the locals are already predicating their political horizons on ideas of partition or reaction to it. And here, what happens in Ireland and what happens in India, Pakistan is very instructive to understand what's happening in Israel-Palestine. So part of a bigger argument that I could not make here today, but that's part of a longer story. I'll be happy to talk about it later on. Is sort of that, of course, each one of those cases has its unique dimensions and a different story. You can compare two drops of water are not identical. So of course, that every historical situation has its own contours. And of course, that in Palestine, you have a very unique settler colonial context that is different from, of course, the Indian subcontinent. But the run-up, to the 1948 war and the idea of creating a nation state that has this kind of ambivalent relationship with what is Jewishness and so on, is part of that bigger story. So complexities that you have in Pakistan about what it means to be, how to define a Muslim state and so on, is there. And even the legal apparatus that the Israeli state is using to confiscate property from Palestinians that left their houses was borrowed directly from India, Pakistan, due to that religion. So that's part of the story we need to tell. So it doesn't mean that the story ends. In all of those cases, post-partition spaces become very volatile and very, the partition didn't solve the problem in neither of those three cases. And it's not a coincidence that all those three cases are under the auspices of the British Empire. So this is not simply a similarity that comes out of nowhere, but that's part of a longer story. And Joseph, excellent question. And in a way, you started answering your own questions brilliantly, because you're right that, of course, we tend to read the history as 1948 as this kind of a end point of history, that the establishment of the Israeli state as that's it. And this is definitely, for me as someone growing up in Israel, of course, these are the textbook I consumed. And it took me a while, and I had to read a lot of British history and also watch a lot of old newsreel footage to see that the same ceremony that that you see the last British soldier leaving the colony and the British flag is going down, and then the new that was rehearsed time and again in so many other places in the world. So sort of, oh, okay, let's think, it's not that unique. So the banal answer to your question is absolutely, you're right, that the story continues Of course, a nation state changes the rule of the game, and you could no longer dominate in an old-fashioned way, but you have indirect relationship. And the story, I would say, ends very clearly in the Suez crisis. So part of what I will try to do in my next book is not to end the story of the connection between British Empire and Zionism in 1948, but exactly to end it in 1956. And this is where, for various reasons. So in a way, we're on the same page here. But so why do we remember it differently? Multiple reasons. I mean, absolutely correct that our tendency, popular memory, public memory highlights the last short but hyper dramatic years of the 40s, and especially, I would say, even the last 3 years of the British Mandate, 1945 to 48, where you have active resistance by Jews to the British presence. Some of it has to do with popular memory and movies like Exodus. Some of it has to do with the radicalization of American Jewry, that they want to see the Israeli War of Independence as modeled after the American War of Independence. There's a long story we need to talk about the way we even call the War of Independence, which is a complete misnomer because, of course, Jews were fighting Palestinians. The British left, and it was not the War of Independence like 1776. So that's part of it. And a lot of it in the Israeli context has to do with the Menachem Begin reading of history. Menachem Begin, when he came to power in 1977, wants to present the movement as an anti-colonial movement from day one. And therefore, when he comes to visit, in Britain, and people are not shaking his hand because he's the mastermind behind the bombing of King David Hotel, he says, "You're hypocrites. You have no problem meeting with Irish freedom fighters. I was the same." Right. So that was a way in which, the Israeli right wing read, highlighted that element. And to this day, you will see even kind of a complete, exaggerated readings of self-importance in the Israeli revisionist right, really believing that the entire British Empire collapsed due to the paramilitary apparatus of fighting the British. So this brings us to the murky territory of memory and politically motivated memory and history. But that's part of what the ongoing debate in the scholarship. And I think that part of what the scholarship tries to do today is exactly to challenge this very, very dominant narrative. So thank you for your question.
Thank you. Yeah, really great questions. I didn't have time to talk about the language, but I think you made a really nice link thinking about how in Shaban's novel we have Yiddish language that's so predominant and this pro-diaspora romanticized version of the diaspora. I think one of the really interesting things, as I tried to show in my very brief overview of the novel, is that you can't really pin Shaban down. Like, he keeps moving in different directions, and you're like, are you pro a Jewish state? Are you against a Jewish state? You're obviously living in diaspora and you see the benefits of that. So I think it's a really interesting work in terms of trying to think about the critique he's trying to achieve. But I think this idea of romanticizing and almost thinking about, what would have happened if we had created a state that was more inspired by the diaspora and more built on Jewish diaspora identity rather than completely rejecting that. So I think that's a really important point. And I think, yeah, you're right. I think all three novels really emphasize this idea that in a way in which Zionism inevitably ran into the same problems in these different counterfactual states or territories due to its approach to nation building. And I'm not sure if other national movements would fare differently, but the sense of if you move into a territory where there's an indigenous population, it will inevitably result in a clash and a sense of destabilization of the territory and your own identity. So I think that's also a really interesting point of comparison between the three texts. If you think about the quite different models that they envision, and in all three models, you see the same ideas emerging in terms of how Zionism or a Jewish national movement is unable to flourish if it's built on taking over someone else's territory. So I think that's a really important point. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Very, very comprehensive answers. So we do have a question from the online auditorium, and it's from Anushka Alexander Rose. By the way, thank you very much for joining us from America. Very gratifying to see you here. So this one's for Isabel. How do these counterfactual narratives interact with other alternate histories which focus on the war Holocaust, for example, by Philip Roth or The Man in the High Castle?
Thank you, Anushka. That's a really great question. I think one of the really interesting things about these counterfactual narratives is that, as you suggested, you can almost divide them into those two categories. So the ones that think about the Holocaust as one of the foundational aspects of Israeli identity or Jewish identity, and on the other hand, state building and the establishment of Israel. So I think it's interesting how some of these narratives, and I was also thinking of Levi Tidar published another counterfactual account called A Man Lies Dreaming, where he imagines if Hitler had been, I think, continued living, and he had to take on a fake identity. And I think he's a very low rate detective, if I remember correctly. So this really, yeah, it's a brilliant book. But I think it's really interesting how he's addressing one of these other key issues. So defamiliarizing this figure of Hitler, like ridiculing him. And I think it's interesting how counterfactual histories, of course, focus on these key moments in history, but take quite different approaches in terms of the critiques that they're trying to effect. So if you, for example, think about counterfactual histories that focus on the Holocaust, there's often a sense of like, there's still a sense of threat, of danger. So the Holocaust is over, it could happen again. But on the other hand, you also have this sense of like ridiculing and the tradition of the satires about Hitler and the Nazis. So I think, yeah, that's an interesting how should I call it? I think there's an interesting dynamic going on in terms of the two approaches that counterfactual histories take. Sorry, I should have looked at the camera. I was looking at the audience in the room. Yeah, I hope this answers your question, Anushka. Sorry, I wasn't looking at the Zoom audience.
Are there any questions from the Zoom audience?
Yeah, or maybe perhaps any sort of follow-up from anyone here. We've had a couple from the floor in the room. We've had one from Zoom. Had more than a couple actually from the floor, about 5 or 6. Supplementary or follow-up questions, maybe?
Well, I have one.
I think that's good, yeah.
Okay. To Isabel, you said that, I mean, these novels, the role of, they have this role of fixing history, or they are asking the question of, fixing history, taking responsibility. Where they followed, did they actually start a conversation and, discussions, and how were they received, both in Israel and, I don't know, in the States? Or did they start a conversation more efficiently, maybe, than political writing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, as per usual with literature, they didn't change the world. I think one of the interesting things, I'm just thinking about Nava Samuel's novel Israel, which was published in 2005 or 2006, I can't remember, but only translated in 2016. So there's just like this lag of 10 years until the novel moved beyond the Hebrew language space into the Anglophone sphere. I think it was quite well received in Israel as part of a larger trend in speculative fiction. Again, Levi Tidar is another example. He's written quite a few novels. I think it's almost, and I think that's probably the nature of the genre, there's a sense like to almost dismiss these counterfactuals because they're like in a science fiction-y fantasy novel. And I think a bit like the other counterfactuals that just imagine, oh, if the Holocaust hadn't happened or if the Nazis had continued living, it's really easy to dismiss them in a sense by saying like, oh, this is just someone's fantasy. So I think in a way, by choosing that specific genre, I think especially Tidar is probably almost diminishing his own critique because it might not reach the mainstream audience, because especially him, he's known as a fantasy and science fiction writer rather than as a, if you want to use that term, more serious, highbrow literary writer. So I think it's quite difficult to reach a wider audience and to change their minds. And I think it's quite easy for a small audience of literary scholars to kind of get access to those critiques. But I think in a wider scheme of things, unfortunately, there hasn't been any major impacts, even though I think Nava Samuel is very well known in Israel and she's known for her critical work, but I think the wider impact is quite limited.
If I may, Isabel, I remember, I mean, it's also from which language you translated, which, I mean, Michael Chabon was very well received in Israel. His novel, I mean, again, in standards of a small reading public, and it's not a bestseller in English language standards, but it was relatively well received. There was a kind of also the fact that he's married to an ex-Israeli. It also was part of his public persona in Israel and so on. And a few years ago, I think it was almost a decade ago, the NGO Breaking the Silence tried to organize. They tried and succeeded in having a group of authors coming and writing short stories about it, and he was very much involved in this. So he inserted himself into kind of a very volatile political discussion in Israel, and of course hated vehemently by the right, admired by the left. So it's kind of if the speculative, the fiction was still open to interpretation. I mean, you cannot. He doesn't state his politics openly. That was a later gesture that made it very clear for the Israelis. So I just remembering it myself as simply as a passive consumer of that literature.
Yeah, and thank you for reminding me of that, because he actually published a collection of the stories of essays, I think called Kingdom of Ashes. And
Precisely, that's a collection.
So that's really
together with the yellow bottom.
Yeah,
precisely.
Really sorry to keep stealing a microphone, Arie. So got another comment from the online auditorium on Zoom. Deborah Baum, is Chabon's novel the only comic novel of the three?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I'm trying to remember because it's been a while since I read them. I think they all have comic elements. I think Chabon is probably the funniest out of the three, but they're all quite lighthearted. And an interesting thing that Nava Samuel does, I'm not sure to what extent it's comedic, she keeps using the same name, so you get really confused as a reader. You might have remembered the governor is called Emanuela Winona Noah. There's Manuel Mordecai Noah. So she just keeps playing around with these names and not really making clear whether people are related. I think, yeah, Chabon is probably the funniest one. I'm trying to remember Tidar. I think his is also quite like in the tradition almost of, because there's a bit of like detective vibe going on in Tidar's novel as well. So there's almost like dry humor, sarcastic approach to depicting events. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting comment to make. So thinking about the comedy that they use and to what extent that contributes to their critique. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we've given a few good opportunities for everyone to ask a question now. Joseph. Joseph, no, you do. Come on, it's fine.
No, I'm just wondering if it.
Isabel, I'm just wondering, is there a genre of Jewish alternative histories? I mean, how big is it? I just came to mind that I guess it's the dystopian, the Roth Plot Against America, and also Howard Jacobson's J. I just wonder how big is this kind of subgenre, and are Jewish writers more preoccupied with creating alternative histories than perhaps others, or is it just a few?
That's a really good question. I'm still at the very beginning of this project, so if anyone knows any other books, please do let me know. It's interesting in terms of like specifically reimagining the creation of a Jewish state. I've only found one other book, which is Simone Zelich's Judenstaat, where she imagines that a Jewish state is created, I think, in Saxony in Germany. So quite a different approach. I think mainly the ones I found focus on big historical events, so Holocaust, reimagining the outcome of World War II, the Holocaust not happening. Sorry, you look like you.
I'm just going to say, it's not a literature, the obvious comparison, the Medina Weimar, the Yael Bartala, the artist.
Oh, and yeah.
Films.
Yeah, in Europe will be stunned, yes.
In different format.
Yeah, and I think in terms of films, there have been a lot of counterfactual histories. I think they often focus on war, and I'm trying to remember, I think Rosenfeld has quite a few, I think he has a whole book on what ifs of Jewish history, but I can't remember any of the other examples, sorry. Yeah, but I think it's interesting in terms of, I think it's quite a niche genre, but it's really, I think, trying to become more mainstream, at least in the literary space, because I feel like in films, it's quite, you find it quite often. So I feel like literature is really starting to explore the possibilities of using that genre to critique contemporary events and approaches. So.
Thank you very much. Great questions. I think there's another one actually, isn't there, from Anushka. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, I often hold it quite close. Perhaps to lead on from that, and Joseph Devereux's comments, is counterfactualism quite particularly, in inverted commas, Jewish comedic, uninverted commas, or surreal approach to dealing with that kind of Holocaust trauma or complexity of Israeli politics, go against the big, inverted commas, Auschwitz, uninverted commas, survivor narrative genre? Thank you very much. Great question.
Yes, thank you. I was about to say that's a really fascinating question. I think there's certainly a sense of agency that comes through, but a more playful approach to agency that I find in the counterfactuals that I've read, and just this sense of like rewriting history. I think, as you rightly say, going against this idea of the survivor narrative genre. But I think also just giving a different insight into aspects of Jewish identity. So I feel like, and it might be, I'm thinking of other examples of speculative fiction. The one that comes to mind is being based in Australia. A lot of Indigenous writers in Australia have recently started using speculative fiction. So I think it's part of a bigger movement of Indigenous futurisms, the sense of using speculative fiction to critique contemporary, contemporary events, but also history and historical approaches. And I think especially in the Australian context, there's often a sense of bringing to attention forgotten or misrepresented events. So I don't think there's the same approach in the Jewish counterfactuals, because I don't think it's about forgotten. Well, I guess the Uganda plan is part of a forgotten history. I think it's almost like revisiting these crucial moments in history and giving a different angle on them. So yeah, I think really good question. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question, or I should say rather, Mark Cornwall, our head of department, has a question for Arie. I think we're going to hear from him. It's on Zoom. Hello.
Hello. Sorry, I had to leave halfway through, but I did catch all of Arie's talk, so I thought it was really fascinating paper actually, and I had numerous questions, but I'll just throw one at you, which I hope you haven't had already. I was really just interested in. I was interested in where Roth and I suppose his brothers really, but mainly him, who went out to Palestine and stayed there. I was interested in whether he formulated his ideas really on the basis of just being very pragmatic about the situation and coming at it very much from his British background, or whether he was also influenced by the and interpreted the British Empire as being something very positive. Now, was that really in contrast to what he might have seen as the negative dimensions of, say, the Jewish experience in the Russian Empire, possibly even some negative experiences in the Habsburg Empire or contemporary Nazi Germany? So in that, when you looked at it that way, perhaps the British Empire looked at in his view, he saw it as in a very positive way. So I was interested whether he was weighing those up in his mind, as far as we could tell, or whether he's just a very pragmatic person who is seeing, thinking about, well, what can we work with in terms of my loyalty to both Zionism and my loyalty to a British Empire, I suppose, if that makes sense.
No, brilliant. It makes perfect sense. Of course. I mean, I hate answers that say both, but in a way, I think that's. I mean, it's one of the challenges here is that depends on how we look at it. I mean, he was a decorated soldier in World War I. I mean, it's more than simply opportunistic. Let's use that opportunity, sort of finding a way. So of course, there is a very strong pragmatic element here. One can speculate, right? In the meager, for us as academics familiar with the awful job market, that he wasn't opportunistic, that he could secure a job, academic job in Palestine. There was suddenly a new university and suddenly they need professors. So one can say, yes, he's pragmatic even on that respect. That I think, but there's a deeper visionary element there that is trying to make this combination of cultural Zionism, Hadamian Zionism, and British Empire go hand in hand, that comes with a deep admiration of British Empire that you can see also among numerous other Zionists. I was talking with George about it earlier on, that often in Russian Jews that are coming from the Russian Empire, you would see this kind of amazing admiration of the British Empire. We came from an empire, you have an empire, but your empire has a parliament. We're drinking tea, we are drinking tea, but you guys also have an order and so on. And you didn't have this, of course, after 1917, a bloody revolution and so on. I mean, I'm not making these generalizations about everyone, but definitely in some of the key figures in the early years of the Hebrew University, that's definitely their case. And someone else that also his papers ended up here at Southampton, Professor Zelig Brodetsky was a Russian Jew by birth, but all his academic career was at Leeds University, was a mathematician, and then was appointed the president of the Hebrew University at exactly the crucial years of transitioning from mandate to independence. So you see them torn exactly on that element. It's sort of how to think about cutting away from an empire, not too much. So of course, the Russian Empire for all of them is there as kind of this alternative dark version of an empire that, in comparison, the British Empire always looks much brighter and better. So it's absolutely, definitely the part of the context and the atmosphere, if you like, of those for those figures.
Could I have a follow-up question very quickly? My other follow-up question was really at the start of your talk, where you set out somebody like Hobsbawm and the kind of what we would now call possibly the old idea that there's a complete difference between empire and nation, empire building and nation building. And I suppose it's a big question, but why do you think that has been so entrenched for so long? And I was trying to think, was it because of Hobsbawm's Marxist take on things? Why is it that we're suddenly finding that there were these contemporary thinkers who did not think that empire and nation was completely contradictory? Because I think Roth is one example, isn't he? But there are probably lots of other examples that we're only just discovering. I wonder why we've come to think that they could be meshed together, and past commentators and historians didn't go down that road.
That's a wonderful question. I think that part of it has to do perhaps at what glues the two talks we heard today. I think that we're attracted to it also because of those alternative roads not taken type of studies. I think that this is not unique to Jewish history, not at all. I'm thinking about Gary Wilder, thinking about African states and undergoing decolonization. Frederick Cooper, who I've mentioned, and others are also thinking about, there was even discussion about the lost federal moment, that so many of the states that ended up as in process of decolonization as independent states went through a phase that they were thinking about themselves in constellations that are federal, that are quasi-imperial, and sort of the clear cut that was so established is now being challenged. I think it's part of the nice, I mean, in the scholarly level, I think that this is part of the nice dynamic of scholarship that is continually revisiting itself. There's, of course, Eric Hobsbawm had a very strong a Marxist skeleton to the narrative, but it's also was a wonderful way to explain history to a broader public. I think that this is also the narratives that presents World War I as the clear cut that allows us to, even when we are professors at the university, to say, okay, I'm now offering a class about the long 19th century, and then it will be a completely different story when I'll teach the short 20th century. Slicing, we find these narratives very helpful, and when we slice the cake in very convenient ways, but then the classic questions of historians about continuity and change start interrupting and spoiling that in many respects. But I think that the new literature, again, it's hard to talk about everyone because they're coming from different backgrounds. Some of them are studying Africa, some of them are studying the French colonial projects in North Africa, and not sub-Saharan Africa. Others are thinking about different imperial projects, and the Habsburg context, which we haven't mentioned, that you're the expert on, is even another fascinating expert. This is where, you know, scholars realize that many of the thinkers, again, the realities did not correspond with their visions, but many of the thinkers were not imagining these independent sovereign nation states that often, you know, were massive failures. It was also disenchantment from the post-colonial state. It was not that heaven, and it did not realize the promises, and even more so, often was seen as not less brutal and violent than the previous kind of a colonial system. So I think that this also bleeds into the kind of the motivation of thinkers today, or historians today, to rethink these very clear-cut numbers. But we have to have over coffee a long conversation about the Habsburg Empire and the way Jewish thinkers were looking at the Habsburg Empire when developing ideas about autonomy and small nation nationalism within the context of a greater multinational empire, but rather than simply a nation state that is independent and cut off from a bigger entity. I think that's the cutting edge of the scholarship today.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. So maybe I will conclude. Thank you. It was very, very stimulating. Thank you so much. We are very happy to have you. And thank you to George for actually leading and organizing the visiting fellows. You did a great job. We have two wonderful fellows, and I like the interdisciplinarity and how your papers and your research respond to each other. So have a wonderful end of your stay, Arie, and beginning, Isabel, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.